In the spring of 1942, at the height of the Second World War, a single sheet of paper landed on Winston Churchill's desk. It was 1 page long, never more. No technical jargon, no lengthy appendix, just a clean, precise argument that would shape the course of the entire British bombing campaign against Germany. This was not unusual. A memo like this arrived every single day, sometimes 2 or 3. They covered everything from radar countermeasures to submarine warfare, from aircraft production to the chemistry of explosives. Each one translated the bewildering complexity of modern technological war into language that a politician could act upon. The author of these memos was not a general. He was not an admiral. He held no military rank of any kind. He was a physicist, a man who carried a slide rule in his pocket the way other men carried a cigarette case. And he had more influence over which inventions received funding and which were thrown in the bin than any committee, any ministry, or any uniformed officer in Britain. His name was Frederick Lindemann. Churchill called him the scientific lobe of my brain. The scientific establishment called him something rather less flattering. Half the Nobel laureates in Britain considered him a dangerous amateur who had no business whispering in the Prime Minister's ear. They believed his judgments were reckless, his statistics were wrong, and his influence was a threat to the war effort itself. Here is the extraordinary part. They were not entirely wrong, and they were not entirely right either, because this same man, this deeply controversial, widely despised figure, helped convince Churchill to back radar, to pursue the atomic bomb, and to invest in the electronic warfare that won the Battle of the Beams. Oh, and one more thing. He was born in Germany. To understand how a German-born physicist ended up more powerful than the generals, we need to go back half a century to a small spa town in southern Germany, where in 1886 a boy was born who would spend his entire life being treated as an outsider. Frederick Alexander Lindemann came into the world on the 5th of April, 1886. And even his birth was a contradiction. His mother, Olga Noble, was a wealthy American widow from Connecticut. She had traveled to Baden-Baden, the fashionable spa town in southern Germany, to take the cure, the mineral baths that Victorian society considered essential for good health. She was not planning to give birth there, but the baby arrived early, and so Frederick Lindemann was born on German soil, a fact that would cause him, in his own bitter words, endless passport difficulties for the rest of his life. His father, Adolphus Frederick Lindemann, came from a French-speaking Catholic family in the Palatinate region of Alsace. He was an engineer, a serious one, who had helped lay the transatlantic telegraph cables connecting Europe to America and built waterworks across Germany. After the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, Adolphus had taken British citizenship and settled his family on a large estate near Sidmouth in Devon. By 1914, his annual income approached £20,000, a fortune equivalent to roughly £1.5 million today. He built a private astronomical observatory and a laboratory on the grounds, where his son first learned to love science. So the question that would follow Lindemann his entire life, what exactly are you, had no simple answer from the very beginning. He was born in Germany to a father of French Alsatian blood and an American mother, raised on an English country estate and educated across the continent. He attended Blair Lodge boarding school in Scotland, then the gymnasium in Darmstadt, and finally arrived at the University of Berlin to study under Walter Nernst, one of the founding fathers of modern physical chemistry. Lindemann earned his doctorate at the age of 24 for work on low-temperature physics and the specific heats of solids, research that helped confirm the quantum theory predictions of a certain Albert Einstein. And then, in October of 1911, something remarkable happened. The 25-year-old Lindemann received an invitation to the first Solvay conference in Brussels, the most exclusive gathering in the history of physics. He was the youngest person in the room. Around him sat Einstein, Marie Curie, Max Planck, Hendrik Lorentz, Ernest Rutherford, the titans who were rewriting the laws of the universe. Lindemann served as joint secretary, taking notes while giants argued about the nature of matter itself. He spoke German and French like a native. He carried a faint but unmistakable German accent in his English for the rest of his days. His critics, and there would be many, gave him a mocking nickname that stuck. They called him Baron Berlin. But here is what his critics never understood. Lindemann did not love Germany. He did not even particularly like it. His loyalty, fierce, stubborn, and absolute, was to Britain. And when the moment came to prove it, he did not hesitate for a second. In the summer of 1914, Lindemann was in Germany, playing in a European tennis championship, when the news broke that war was imminent. He abandoned the tournament immediately and crossed the border before the gates slammed shut. Had he waited even a few days longer, he would have been interned as an enemy alien, a British citizen trapped in hostile territory. Instead, he made it home to England and threw himself into the war effort with a fury that went beyond patriotism. It was personal. From that moment on, his hatred of Germany became, in the words of those who knew him, almost pathological. The man they mocked as Baron Berlin had chosen his side, and he was about to prove his loyalty in a way that would leave the test pilots at Farnborough absolutely speechless, by climbing into an aircraft and deliberately throwing it into a spinning nosedive that had claimed more lives than enemy fire. In 1915, Lindemann joined the scientific staff of the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough, and he walked straight into a crisis that was claiming more lives than the Germans. The aircraft spin was the single greatest mystery in aviation. When an aeroplane entered a spin, a terrifying corkscrew descent rotating around its own axis, there was almost nothing a pilot could do. The de Havilland DH-2, one of the most widely flown fighters of the war, earned a grim nickname. They called it the spinning incinerator. During the First World War, more pilots were lost to spinning accidents during training than to enemy action in combat. The problem was not courage. The problem was that nobody understood the aerodynamics of what was actually happening. In 1912, a Royal Navy lieutenant named Wilfred Park had accidentally discovered that applying opposite rudder could stop a spin. But Park perished in a crash just weeks later, and his observation remained an anecdote rather than a method. No one had explained why it worked. Lindemann decided to solve it. Working at Farnborough, he developed a mathematical theory of spin dynamics. Both wings stalled at different angles of attack, creating an asymmetric lift condition that sustained the rotation. Opposite rudder combined with pushing the stick forward should break the cycle. An elegant theory. But the only way to prove it was to go up in an aeroplane, deliberately throw it into a spin, and record what happened on the way down. The superintendent of the factory, Mervyn O'Gorman, had forbidden scientists from flying, haunted by the loss of test pilot Ted Busk in a fireball over the airfield. But in 1916, O'Gorman was forced out. Lindemann and his colleague William Farren immediately submitted their request. Permission was granted. Now came a difficulty that would have stopped most men. Lindemann was nearly blind in one eye, so he cheated. According to Farren's own account, Lindemann memorized one side of the eye chart using his good eye while chatting with the medical officer. Lindemann told Farren afterward with characteristic calm. He had taken a 50-50 chance. In September of 1916, Frederick Lindemann arrived at the RFC flying school. Picture the scene. Every other trainee was a young military officer in uniform, and then there was Lindemann, tall, gaunt, dressed in a dark suit, wearing a bowler hat and carrying a furled umbrella. He looked like a banker who had wandered onto the wrong field. The ground crews knew his name was German. They knew he spoke with a German accent. One mechanic, a man named Jim Winter, later admitted that he never filled Lindemann's fuel tanks more than a quarter full. He was convinced the German would try to fly back to the fatherland, and Winter was not about to give him enough petrol to get there. By the summer of 1917, Lindemann had accumulated roughly 50 hours of flying experience. He climbed into a BE-2 biplane and took it up to 14,000 feet, the absolute ceiling of the machine. Below him, observers tracked his position through a camera obscura, and then he deliberately threw the aircraft into a spin. While the ground rushed up at him, Lindemann did not panic. He read the instruments, airspeed, altitude, accelerometer, committing the numbers to memory because there was no recording equipment. Just a half-blind physicist in a bowler hat, falling deliberately, watching the needles move. He applied opposite rudder, pushed the stick forward. The rotation slowed, the wings unstalled. The BE-2 pulled out and flew level. Then he climbed back to 14,000 feet and did it again in the opposite direction. He repeated this more than 12 times. The results were published in March of 1918 as Report and Memoranda Number 411. It was the first scientific analysis of aircraft spin dynamics in history. The recovery technique it established, opposite rudder, stick forward, has not changed in over 100 years. Every student pilot in the world today learns a method proven by a half-blind physicist who fell out of the sky on purpose, in a machine held together with wire and fabric. The spin brought Lindemann a reputation, but his next move would bring him an empire. In 1919, he arrived at Oxford and found a physics laboratory that did not even have mains electricity. The spin tests had made Lindemann's name, but reputation alone does not change history. Institutions do. In 1919, on the recommendation of his Farnborough colleague Henry Tizard, a name that will become very important later, Lindemann was appointed Dr. Lees Professor of Experimental Philosophy at Oxford. The title was prestigious. The laboratory was a disaster. The Clarendon had no mains electricity. Rooms were lit by fishtail gas burners from the Victorian era. The workshop contained a single foot-pedal lathe and a blacksmith's anvil. Oxford physics had no connection to any great name in British science, and its reputation had sunk practically to zero. Lindemann looked at this wreckage and saw possibility. Over the next decade, he transformed the Clarendon through sheer force of will and an unexpected talent. He was a brilliant recruiter. He attracted researchers like Thomas Merton and Gordon Dobson, who would pioneer the study of the ozone layer. He installed electricity, bought proper equipment, and dragged the laboratory into the 20th century. On the 13th of January 1933, Kurt Mendelssohn achieved the first liquefaction of helium in Britain at the Clarendon, a milestone in low-temperature physics. But the real transformation began that same year when Adolf Hitler came to power. The Nazi regime moved with terrifying speed against Jewish academics. World-class physicists and chemists were stripped of their positions and driven from German universities. Many had nowhere to go. Lindemann did not write letters of concern. He did not sign petitions. He climbed into his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, crossed the Channel, and drove into Germany personally to recruit the best minds that Hitler was throwing away. He convinced Sir Harry McGowan of Imperial Chemical Industries to fund positions at Oxford. And the men he brought back would change the world. Franz Simon, a physical chemist from Breslau, who would devise the gaseous diffusion method for separating uranium-235, making the atomic bomb physically possible. The brothers Fritz and Heinz London, who pioneered superconductivity theory. Even Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel laureate, found refuge at Oxford through Lindemann's efforts. Under his direction, the Clarendon became what historians have called the largest and most renowned center for low-temperature physics in the world. A laboratory that had started with a foot-pedal lathe was now pushing the boundaries of knowledge at temperatures approaching absolute zero. And there was one more connection that mattered enormously: Lindemann's friendship with Albert Einstein, born at the Solvay Conference in 1911, survived undimmed for over 4 decades. Lindemann arranged 3 visits by Einstein to Oxford between 1931 and 33. They remained close until Einstein passed away in 1955. By the early 30s, Lindemann had taken a derelict laboratory and made it world-class. He had rescued brilliant minds from the Nazis. He was friends with Einstein. He was one of the most influential scientists in Britain. But his true power would not come from Oxford. It would begin on a tennis court at a country house weekend, where he would meet a man who, within 8 years, would become Prime Minister. The friendship that would reshape the course of the Second World War began, of all places, on a tennis court. In the summer of 1921, the Duke of Westminster invited both men to his estate at Eaton Hall. Clementine Churchill partnered with Lindemann for mixed doubles and rather took to him. This was significant because Clementine famously disliked most of Winston's friends. The Duke, suspecting the 2 men would get along, seated them together at dinner. He was right. Churchill and Lindemann discovered an instant rapport. The politician fascinated by science, the scientist fascinated by power. After Lord Birkenhead passed away in 1930, Lindemann became probably Churchill's closest friend. His signature appears 86 times in the Chartwell Visitors Book, more than any other guest, including Brendan Bracken. He stayed 10 or 12 weekends a year throughout the 1930s, during Churchill's wilderness years out of government. Churchill came to rely on Lindemann's company, intellectually stimulating and emotionally sustaining in equal measure. Their dynamic was unlike anything else in British political life. Churchill's standard request was simple and direct. "Professor, 10 lines, please." No matter how complex the subject, atomic physics, radar theory, submarine detection, fuel chemistry, Lindemann would compress it into a single page of clear, homely language that Churchill could act upon. During the war, he produced over 2,000 such memos. He always carried a slide rule for instant calculations, and Churchill exploited this mercilessly. One evening at Chartwell, Churchill demanded that Lindemann calculate the total volume of champagne and spirits he had consumed in his lifetime, and tell him how much of the dining room it would fill. Lindemann consulted his slide rule and delivered the verdict: not more than a few inches. Churchill sighed with theatrical despair. "How much more to do," he said, "and how little time remains." When Churchill was struck by a car on Fifth Avenue in New York in December 1931, Lindemann sent a telegram that only a physicist could have written. He calculated the collision as equivalent to falling 30 feet onto pavement, equal to 6,000 foot-pounds of energy, or stopping a 10-pound brick dropped from 600 feet. He concluded with congratulations on preparing a suitable cushion and skill in taking the bump. Churchill called Lindemann the scientific lobe of my brain, and described his mind as a beautiful piece of mechanism. When a member of Parliament questioned Churchill's reliance on Lindemann in November 1941, Churchill erupted: "Love me, love my dog, and if you do not love my dog, you damn well cannot love me." Spotting the MP later, he bellowed, "Why in hell did you ask that question? Do you not know that he is one of my oldest and greatest friends?" But there was a problem. Lindemann was not the only brilliant scientist who wanted to protect Britain from the bomber threat. There was another, Henry Tizard. And when these two men were put around the same table, the result was catastrophic. In January 1935, the British government formed the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence. It was chaired by Henry Tizard, the same man who had recommended Lindemann for Oxford 16 years earlier. The other members were A.V. Hill, Patrick Blackett, and H.E. Wimperis. These were serious men. Hill and Blackett were both Nobel laureates. Their task was urgent and terrifying: find a scientific answer to the bomber. This committee became the birthplace of radar in Britain. Robert Watson Watt demonstrated that radio waves could detect aircraft, and Tizard's group threw their full support behind developing the technology into an operational defence system. It was precisely the kind of work that could save the country. And then Churchill, still in his wilderness years, but wielding considerable political influence, insisted that Lindemann be added to the committee. It was a condition of his own participation in air defence discussions. Tizard reluctantly agreed. It was a disaster. Almost from the moment Lindemann took his seat in the committee room, the meetings did not know half an hour's harmony. Now, and this is important, the dispute was not about whether radar should be developed. In February 1936, Lindemann wrote to Churchill commending Watson Watt's work on detection and declaring himself an enthusiastic believer in radar. The fight was about priorities. Lindemann wanted parallel development of other technologies: infrared detection, which his own man R.V. Jones was researching at the Clarendon, and aerial mines. These were bombs suspended on wires from parachutes, dropped into the path of incoming bombers. The rest of the committee considered this impractical at best and absurd at worst. But Lindemann did not argue his case with polite academic restraint. He argued it with venom. At one meeting, he abused Tizard in terms so savage that the secretaries had to be sent out of the room. The friendship between the two men, dating back to Farnborough, was destroyed beyond repair. It was personal, It was vicious, and it poisoned everything. In the summer of 1936, Hill and Blackett resigned in protest. They refused to sit in the same room as Lindemann any longer. The committee was dissolved and reconstituted without him. Lindemann was replaced by Edward Appleton. Was Lindemann wrong about the aerial mines? Mostly, yes. They were actually deployed during the Blitz of 1940 and 41, when No. 93 Squadron used Handley Page Harrows to drop them in the path of German night bombers. Only one success was ever claimed. Tactically, they were useless. But here is the crucial question. Did Lindemann's behavior delay radar? The answer is no. Despite the chaos he caused, radar development continued at full speed. By September 1938, 5 chain home stations were operational around the clock. The system was ready when it mattered, for the Battle of Britain. So the verdict on this episode is uncomfortable. Lindemann was right to support radar. He was wrong about aerial mines. And his inability to work with other brilliant people, his poisonous temper, his refusal to compromise, came very close to wrecking the one committee that was doing the most important scientific work in Britain. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. That same day, Churchill returned to government as First Lord of the Admiralty. And the first thing he did was summon Lindemann. When war came, Lindemann was ready. Churchill, first as First Lord of the Admiralty, then as Prime Minister from May 1940, gave him an office at Downing Street, and something no scientist in British history had ever possessed: direct, daily, unrestricted access to the man running the war. Lindemann created S-Branch, a small statistical unit staffed with economists and scientists whose job was to translate the chaos of total war into numbers Churchill could understand. Shipping losses, aircraft production rates, food imports, ammunition stocks, manpower allocation, every critical metric of the war effort passed through Lindemann's hands before reaching the Prime Minister. One memo a day, every day, for 5 years. Clear, concise, actionable. This was his instrument of power, not a laboratory, but a fountain pen and a slide rule. His judgment was tested early. On the 12th of June 1940, a 28-year-old scientist named R.V. Jones presented extraordinary intelligence to an emergency air ministry meeting. The Germans had developed Knickerbein, intersecting radio beams that guided their bombers to targets in Britain with unprecedented accuracy. Lindemann's first reaction was skeptical. He argued that such precise beam propagation over hundreds of miles was physically impossible. Jones produced the evidence: captured equipment, prisoner interrogations, technical analysis. Within 24 hours, Lindemann reversed his position completely. He backed Jones and the countermeasures that followed, bending and jamming the German beams, saved countless lives during the Blitz. It was a revealing moment. Lindemann could be wrong, stubbornly and publicly wrong. But unlike many proud men, he could also change his mind fast when the evidence demanded it. He championed other projects that the military establishment dismissed. MD1, known informally as Churchill's toy shop, was a small weapons development unit that Lindemann helped protect from bureaucratic interference. It produced the sticky bomb, the limpet mine, and the PIAT anti-tank weapon. Practical, unglamorous devices that saved infantry lives on battlefields from North Africa to Normandy. But in March of 1942, Lindemann placed a single sheet of paper on Churchill's desk, just one page, that would split the British scientific community in two and contribute to the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. On the 30th of March 1942, Lindemann, now Baron Cherwell, and a member of the War Cabinet, submitted a memo to Churchill that would become one of the most controversial documents of the entire war. It was one page long. It became known as the dehousing paper. The argument was built on arithmetic. Lindemann analysed the effects of German bombing raids on British cities and calculated that 1 ton of bombs demolished between 20 and 40 dwellings, rendering 100 to 200 people homeless. He then projected forward. If Britain produced 10,000 heavy bombers by mid-1943, they could systematically destroy the housing stock of every major German city with a population over 50,000. 1/3 of the entire German population would lose their homes. And here was the key assertion, the cold, clinical sentence that would define his legacy. People seem to mind having their house demolished, he wrote, more than having their friends or even relatives lose their lives. There seemed little doubt that this would break the spirit of the people. The opposition from Britain's finest scientific minds was immediate and furious. Henry Tizard, Lindemann's old enemy, reviewed the calculations and concluded they were 5 times too optimistic. Patrick Blackett, the Nobel laureate and pioneer of operational research, calculated they were 6 times too high. He added a brutal observation. The 40 tons of bombs required to cause 8 German civilian casualties would cost 6 British aircrew and 1 aircraft. Scarcely a reasonable exchange. Solly Zuckerman surveyed the actual effects of bombing on Hull and Birmingham and found no evidence of breakdown in civilian morale at any intensity yet experienced. Lindemann quoted Zuckerman's statistics on housing destruction. He ignored the conclusions about morale. The minority view, as C.P. Snow later noted, was not merely defeated, it was squashed, with the faint but just perceptible smell of a witch hunt. Blackett's critique was suppressed. He was cut out of key communication channels. Scientists who challenged Lindemann's numbers found themselves frozen out. The post-war Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed what Tizard and Blackett had warned. Lindemann's estimates were not 5 or 6 times too high. They were 10 times too high. German war production did not collapse. It actually continued rising until late 1944, under the ruthless management of Albert Speer. Civilian morale declined, but never broke. Under a police state, demoralized citizens simply could not translate their misery into political change. Yet the picture is not entirely one-sided. The bombing campaign tied down nearly 2 million Germans in homeland air defense. Over 20,000 anti-aircraft guns, including the devastating 88mm pieces desperately needed as anti-tank weapons on the Eastern Front, were kept pointing at the sky instead of at Soviet tanks. The Luftwaffe was forced to divert an ever-increasing share of its fighter strength to defend the Reich, weakening it everywhere else. Between 350,000 and 600,000 German civilians perished in Allied bombing. Lindemann expressed no documented regret. The very word he chose, dehousing, was itself a euphemism, a piece of clinical language designed to obscure the human reality of what was being proposed. But there was one area where Lindemann was absolutely right, and where his judgment may have determined the outcome not just of this war, but of the entire second half of the 20th century. In the summer of 1941, while the bombing debate still lay months in the future, Lindemann was involved in something far more consequential: the birth of the atomic age. The Maud Committee, a group of physicists including several of the refugees Lindemann himself had rescued from Nazi Germany, had spent over a year investigating whether an atomic bomb was physically achievable. Their conclusion, delivered in July 1941, was extraordinary. It could be done. A weapon of unprecedented destructive power could be built using uranium-235, separated by the gaseous diffusion method that Franz Simon had developed at the Clarendon laboratory. The very scientists Lindemann had driven his Rolls-Royce into Germany to save were now telling him that the most powerful weapon in human history was within reach. The Maud report was dense, technical, and almost impenetrable to a non-scientist. Lindemann performed what one historian called one of his most important acts of compression. He distilled the committee's findings into language Churchill could grasp and act upon. Britain became the first nation in the world to officially approve the development of atomic weapons, the program known as tube alloys. Churchill himself acknowledged the debt. In 1945, he stated plainly, unless Lindemann had kept him well informed, he would not have turned on the full power of the state to what was then a remote and speculative project. But even here, Lindemann's judgment was not flawless. In October 1941, he advised Churchill against close atomic collaboration with the United States. He believed Britain could and should develop the weapon independently. It was a miscalculation with lasting consequences. By the time Britain reversed course and sought full American partnership, the United States had invested billions and had no interest in an alliance of equals. The Quebec Agreement of 1943 relegated Britain to junior partner status. After the war, the 1946 McMahon Act cut Britain out of American atomic research entirely, forcing the country to develop its own bomb from scratch. On the 3rd of October 1952, Operation Hurricane detonated Britain's first atomic device off the coast of Western Australia. Lindemann, by then serving again as Paymaster General under Churchill's second government, oversaw the program as the government's atomic energy advisor. He became what colleagues called the father and progenitor of the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, established in 1954. The atomic bomb was his triumph, but there was another technology where Lindemann was catastrophically wrong, and where Churchill raised his voice to his closest friend for the first and only time. Lindemann's influence saved lives. It also cost them. 2 episodes in particular reveal the price of concentrating so much scientific authority in one man's hands. The first was window, strips of aluminium foil cut to the wavelength of German radar. When dropped from aircraft in bundles, they created thousands of false echoes on enemy screens, effectively blinding the entire German air defense network. The technology was simple, cheap, and devastatingly effective. It was also ready for deployment by early 1942. Lindemann blocked it. His fear was logical, but ultimately wrong. If the British used window, the Luftwaffe would copy it within weeks and use it to launch a new bombing campaign against Britain, whose own radar defenses would be equally blinded. For 18 months, the technology sat unused, while Bomber Command flew into the teeth of German radar-directed fighters and flak. The losses were severe. When Churchill finally authorized window in July 1943 for the raids on Hamburg, the results were immediate. German radar operators watched helplessly as their screens dissolved into chaos. Bomber losses dropped dramatically. And the great irony, the Germans had independently developed identical technology, which they called Dweppel. They had refrained from using it for exactly the same reason Lindemann had suppressed window. Both sides had been paralyzed by the same fear. The second failure was worse, because it was not a matter of caution, but of arrogance. By mid-1943, intelligence reports were accumulating that Germany was developing a long-range ballistic rocket at a research facility called Peenemünde. At the pivotal cabinet meeting on the 29th of June 1943, Lindemann declared the entire V2 program a great hoax. To put a 4,000 horsepower turbine in a 20-inch space, he argued, was lunacy. The rocket was physically impossible. Churchill turned to R.V. Jones, the same young scientist who had proven the existence of the German navigation beams 3 years earlier. Jones presented evidence that the rocket was very real. Point by point, he dismantled Lindemann's objections. Churchill listened and then said something to his oldest friend that no one in the room had ever heard before. "I want no more of your advocatus diaboli." It was the only time Churchill was ever seen genuinely angry with Lindemann. On the 8th of September 1944, the first V2 struck London, traveling faster than sound, arriving before anyone could hear it coming. Lindemann was definitively, publicly, catastrophically wrong. Lindemann's errors were costly, but for his enemies in the scientific community, the question was bigger than any single miscalculation. The question was whether one man should ever hold this much power over science at all. After the war, the reckoning came, not from politicians, but from scientists. In 1960, C.P. Snow delivered the Godkin Lectures at Harvard University, published as Science and Government. It was a devastating portrait. Snow described Lindemann as venomous, harsh-tongued, and malicious, with a sadistic sense of humor. He made a novelist's fingers itch, Snow wrote. But the lectures were not merely personal. They built toward a verdict that echoed across the scientific world. Whoever he is, Snow declared, whether he is the wisest scientist in the world, we must never tolerate a scientific overlord again. The men who had opposed Lindemann during the war lined up behind this judgment. Patrick Blackett, Nobel laureate in 1948 and the pioneer of operational research, had seen his bombing critiques suppressed and himself cut out of key wartime circles. A.V. Hill, Nobel laureate in 1922, had delivered damaging speeches in Parliament questioning the entire bombing strategy. Solly Zuckerman had watched Lindemann cherry-pick his own research, citing the housing destruction data while ignoring the morale findings that contradicted the dehousing thesis. These were not jealous mediocrities. They were among the finest scientific minds Britain had ever produced, and they believed that one man's privileged access to the Prime Minister had distorted the conduct of the war. Yet the prosecution requires a defense, and the defense is this: Churchill was not a puppet. John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, observed that the Prime Minister was never persuaded simply by the fact that people he liked and respected argued a certain course. The evidence bears this out. Churchill rejected Lindemann's assessment of the V2 publicly and sharply. He overruled Lindemann on American atomic collaboration when it became clear that isolation was untenable. He ensured that Coastal Command received sufficient aircraft for anti-submarine patrols, despite fierce lobbying from the strategic bombing advocates whom Lindemann supported. Lindemann was powerful, but he was not omnipotent. Churchill used him as a translator, a challenger, and occasionally a lightning rod who absorbed criticism that might otherwise have struck the Prime Minister himself. When Lindemann was right, Churchill listened. When Lindemann was wrong, Churchill eventually overruled him. The real question is not whether Lindemann was good or bad. Brilliant men are usually both. The real question, the one Snow posed and no one has answered satisfactorily since, is whether any single individual should ever stand as the sole bridge between science and supreme political power. It was dangerous in 1942. It remains dangerous today. In 1957, an 82-year-old Winston Churchill traveled to Oxford for a funeral. On the 3rd of July, 1957, Frederick Lindemann, Viscount Cherwell, passed away in his sleep in his rooms at Christ Church, Oxford. He was 71 years old. He had lived in those same rooms since 1922, 35 years in the college where Einstein had walked the gardens as his guest. Winston Churchill was 82, frail and in declining health. When he learned that Lindemann was gone, he insisted on traveling to Oxford for the funeral. After the service, someone suggested he rest before the long drive back to Chartwell. Churchill refused. "But I must go to the grave," he said. "I must go to the grave." And so the old Prime Minister, the man who had faced down Hitler, who had rallied a nation from the brink of defeat, walked slowly in the procession to the graveside of one of his dearest friends. Both of Lindemann's titles, Baron Cherwell and Viscount Cherwell, became extinct that day. He had never married, he had no children. The name Cherwell, taken from the river that flows through the Oxford he had transformed, vanished from the peerage as quietly as the man himself had slipped away in his sleep. What remains is the contradiction, and it is a contradiction that refuses to resolve. A German-born man who developed an almost pathological hatred of Germany, a cold, arrogant figure whose valet described him as warm and generous, a man willing to be late for dinner so that he could free a trapped bird, a brilliant scientist whose most consequential wartime calculations proved catastrophically wrong, a vegetarian and animal lover who advocated the systematic destruction of civilian housing across an entire nation, a social climber with continental roots who became an English viscount, a man who rescued Jewish physicists from the Nazis, and those same physicists built the weapon that ended the age of conventional warfare forever. No scientific advisor before or since has held such direct access to supreme political power. Over 2,000 memos, 1 page each, every single day. For 5 years, the fate of inventions, technologies, and strategies passed through the hands of one man sitting in a small office at Downing Street with a slide rule and a fountain pen. Was Churchill's trust justified? The atomic bomb says yes. The dehousing paper says no. The spin recovery technique that saves pilots' lives to this day says yes. The 18 months of suppressed window technology says no. There is no clean verdict, and perhaps that is the point. The question Frederick Lindemann left behind is not about Frederick Lindemann. It is the question C.P. Snow posed to a Harvard audience in 1960, and it has not been answered yet. Should one person, however brilliant, however devoted, however trusted, ever stand alone as the bridge between science and power? Churchill's secret weapon was not a machine, it was one man. And the argument about whether that was wisdom or madness continues to this day.